Hi everyone. Thanks so much for having me today. I've just come down from Kings Park where we were having a National Volunteer Week morning tea, and I wanted to mention that it's National Volunteer Week because the project that I'm telling you about also involved volunteers, amazing volunteer citizen scientists who took part in our Turning Gardeners into Conservationists citizen science project. This was a project that was run by Perth NRM and the University of Western Australia with funding from the Australian Government's Inspiring Australia Science Engagement Program. And I was asked to come and talk about wildlife and wellbeing, and that's exactly what this project was all about. It was looking at the benefits of wildlife-friendly gardening for both biodiversity and for people. So I'd just like to acknowledge that this project took place all throughout the southwest corner of Western Australia, so across many different Noongar country areas, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So our project was looking at green spaces in urban areas, but maybe not the same green spaces that we were just hearing about, like public parks, but the green spaces in between in residential gardens. So when we look at a map of Perth and we can pick out, you know, the reserves and the wetlands and things like that, but there's also an incredible number of private residential gardens that add to the greenscape of Perth. And these gardens, if they're done in a way that can be wildlife friendly, then it provides connectivity for wildlife, resources for wildlife, food, shelter, water, and also opportunities for people to connect with nature. So as part of our project Turning Gardeners into Conservationists, we involve citizen scientists in wildlife-friendly gardening and wildlife monitoring within their own gardens to gain new knowledge about what the benefits of residential gardening for wildlife can be, to build community capacity to contribute to biodiversity conservation, and to understand what are the human health and wellbeing benefits of these practices. So as part of the project, over an 18-month period, we had more than 200 citizen scientists getting involved, and they were doing weekly wildlife monitoring surveys in their gardens. And there's a few examples there, things like spotlight surveys at night time, checking for reptiles under this very simple reptile shelter, bird bath surveys, frog surveys in their garden. So they're doing these every week. And then they also, a subset of people midway through, installed a new wildlife-friendly structure in their garden. So a shelter site, like the reptile shelter, the frog hotel, or a nest box, or a water source like the bird bath or the pond. So I'm focusing on the wellbeing outcomes of this project today, but if you're interested in the biodiversity outcomes, you can check out our website with our community report that I'll share at the end. But I just thought, given that we're at Hydropolis, I'd mention that the bird bath and the pond, the two water sources, were the most frequently visited structures in the study. And the bird bath was the one that was visited by the greatest diversity of birds, and the pond was visited by a great diversity of taxa, so birds, reptiles, frogs and mammals all made use of the pond. So these water sources in residential gardens provide a huge benefit to our native wildlife. But we were also interested to understand, for the people involved in the project, what was the impact of doing these activities on their physical health, their mental well-being and their connection to nature. So we looked at this in two different ways, one with an online survey that we shared with participants at the beginning, the middle and the end of their 18-month wildlife monitoring. And that included these three different metrics, which are metrics of general health, mental well-being and nature relatedness. Then we also wanted to dive a bit deeper and did some interviews with citizen scientists in their gardens to understand a little bit more about their experiences of the monitoring and the installing of the structures, and yeah, just get their personal experiences of it and how it's impacted on them. So I'll just briefly run through the online survey results. So you can see here that we had the baseline, interim and final survey. The darker green line is a group of people who took part in the wildlife monitoring regularly, and then the light green group is a control group who didn't do any of the wildlife monitoring. And we saw some interesting trends. With the nature relatedness scale, that ranges from 1 to 5, and both groups had pretty high levels. I don't know if you can read it, but between 4.4 and 4.8 is where the scale on the side goes. So both groups had a very high connection to nature already, and that didn't really change much over the course of the project. We already had people that were really interested in nature and connected to it. But we did see some interesting trends for some of the other metrics. So the Warwick-Edinburgh mental wellbeing scale on the right, you can see that the control group has a slight decreasing trend, while the wildlife monitoring group has a slight increasing trend. So we're seeing a positive shift there for people that took part in this wildlife monitoring over that long period, that there's this positive trend in their mental wellbeing on that scale. The SF36 scale is the one of general health. It actually includes 8 different measures, so I'm just showing you 2 of them. The emotional wellbeing one has a similar trend to the previous mental wellbeing scale that I showed you in the other slide. And then the general health just shows another example of how we're sort of seeing a very slight increasing trend for the wildlife monitoring group, and then a sort of baseline for the other group. So we were seeing some really interesting trends coming out of the data with these scales, and we are going to be delving deeper into this to understand, are there differences for people that were mainly monitoring birds versus those that were mainly monitoring frogs, that sort of thing. It's all kind of grouped together there. But we also wanted to understand kind of a bit deeper into this data, what's the why behind these trends that we're seeing, particularly for the emotional wellbeing. So that's when we started putting together these in-garden interviews, where we had 20 people. We went to their gardens, and this was all throughout the southwest, so about 6 in Perth and a bunch down in Albany, a few in the Bunbury, Margaret River region. And in their gardens, I was asking them questions about their garden and any natural spaces nearby, their personal motivations for creating a wildlife-friendly garden and their experiences of that, particularly with installing their new structure, their motivations for getting involved in the wildlife monitoring aspect and their experiences of that, and then their intended future actions both within their own gardens and also within their local areas or in other sort of conservation areas. And as we were going through these questions, we also then transcribed them, and we were examining them for these 8 different dimensions of well-being. So emotional, physical, intellectual, environmental, social, spiritual, financial, and vocational. Now the first 6 there were the main ones that were coming out, not so much about the financial or vocational. And I just wanted to share some of the example quotes with you that we were getting from people that link in with these different dimensions of wellbeing. So particularly the environmental and emotional wellbeing were the ones that were popping up the most. So this person said, "You don't own them, wildlife, but it's like you're looking after them. It's your responsibility to protect them to the best of your ability." So this sense of environmental stewardship coming out there. It gives you a nice relaxed feeling watching animals who are free and doing what they want. Suddenly I'm not worried about traffic and problems of the world. I suppose it feels joyful and relief when, it makes you think you're in nature. I think it makes you feel a bit wondrous. It makes you feel a connection. And that's within their own garden, in their own backyard. And then this one, it takes away the anxieties of the world. And I think I tend to feel anxious about the impact of what we've done to our world. So I felt that if I could do something to make a difference, even if it's gardening and increasing the wildlife population of some butterflies or frogs, that was what was really meaningful to them. So we're seeing as well this sort of, these themes of eco-anxiety and eco-grief, but then also the being able to take action within their own garden, and how that also connected to the broader environment around them as well. Some of the other wellbeing dimensions that were popping up in the interviews were intellectual wellbeing, so recognising different species in the garden has been wonderful. It's the excitement of watching the nest box and seeing if something is actually going to inhabit it, and also recognising perhaps what works and what doesn't work from a learning point of view. So for these people, spending months just in their garden examining and observing, they've been learning a lot about the wildlife in their garden and also how they can adapt their garden to better support wildlife. There was also social wellbeing, so people seeing wildlife-friendly gardening as a way for them to connect to other people who share the same interest, particularly for the verge gardening. This was coming out, because being able to talk to your neighbours. Spiritual wellbeing, it's being far more present, sort of like meditation. This related a lot to the wildlife monitoring. A lot of people were saying, particularly with bird counts, that they would go out there with their cup of tea, sit in their comfy chair and just look out at their garden and make note of whatever birds they were seeing. So yeah, recommend that one. Physical wellbeing makes me feel good about being outdoors and doing something a bit physical, not just sitting inside. And then some that sort of connected different elements of wellbeing. This one, kind of a physical and spiritual sense of wellbeing in a way. I think you feel every sense comes alive, from hearing the birds, smelling the blossom or whatever's out in flower, seeing, touching, every sense. So what we found with this project, with both the survey metrics and the more in-depth interviews, was that for these citizen scientists, gardening for wildlife was also gardening for wellbeing. You can read more about it in the community report in terms of the benefits for the wildlife, but things like providing those crucial habitat resources, particularly we were looking at water and shelter sites in this study, but natural food resources are also very important. Another exciting part of the biodiversity side was that we were seeing that people's gardens were supporting reproductive opportunities for urban wildlife, so tadpoles in ponds and eggs in nest boxes, things like that. There was one citizen scientist who sent us in pictures of a red-capped parrot that had laid 6 eggs in the nest box, and then all 6 hatched and all 6 fledged. And then a year later, she was still doing her monitoring, and 5 birds that time, or 5 eggs that time, and all of them hatched and fledged on the exact same day as the previous year. So that was really wonderful, these sort of stories from the citizen scientists. And then in terms of the wellbeing, the wildlife-friendly gardening provides opportunities for people to connect with and support nature in their own backyard. It's been improving their knowledge of their local wildlife. It's a positive action to combat eco-anxiety, and there were many great emotional responses, from joy and surprise to calm, respect and wonder. Yeah, as I said, we've got a community report that details both the biodiversity and the wellbeing elements, and some research papers are coming out. So the website there, perthnrm.com/gardening-for-wildlife, is where you can find out even more detail. I've got it on this slide as well. So I just want to say a huge thank you to the project team, Hannah Gulliver, who I think is speaking tomorrow for Rewild Perth, and then there's Paul Close and Bronte Van Hedden from UWA there as well. And a huge thank you to all of our many project partners who helped get the citizen scientists involved, and all of the citizen scientists themselves. So thank you for listening, and if there's any questions, happy to take them. Thank you.
Participants take it to the next level and actually feed the birds?
That's a good question. We weren't really looking at the supplementary feeding, that sort of thing, of wildlife. We didn't encourage it in any way because it's not really allowed. But I do know that some citizen scientists did mention that they do sometimes like to put out, bird seed and that sort of thing. So we would try and have a conversation with them about that when they did. So I think that is something where some people don't realise that they're not allowed to do that, and don't realise the the damage that can actually cause for wildlife. And I think because these people are so connected to wildlife, yeah, it's a tricky one, but it's a way, they see it maybe as a way for them to connect more with wildlife, but they really need to understand the damage that it can cause for wildlife if they're being fed the wrong thing. So yeah, it's a good question, but something to look into more, I think. Yeah.